Hey guys, Dave here, and this is the Final Fantasy XII remaster running on PS4 and PS4 Pro. This conversion is developed by Virtuous Games, who is responsible for the Final Fantasy X and X-2 remasters, and they did a great job there, embellishing the conversion with improved character models, textures, and other little tweaks throughout, allowing the game to better be displayed at high definition resolutions. But what are we looking at with regards to Final Fantasy XII? Virtuous' recent work with Batman Returns Arkham was something of a mixed bag. Sure, they did a great remastering job in terms of adding brand new effects and reworking the core artwork, but PS4 Pro support was really poor, with the developer doing very little to take proper advantage of Sony's higher powered console. So what's the score with Final Fantasy XII then? Well, I can say that in terms of the remastering work, Virtuous has done another great job here in terms of taking the PS2 original's visuals and having those scale nicely up to HD resolutions. And there's plenty of changes here, more than just the resolution boost. But in terms of PlayStation 4 Pro support, well, that's disappointing, and the game fails to hit 4K on Sony's system. Anyway, more on that in a bit. To start, let's kick things off with a look at how the PS4 remaster holds up against the PS2 original. What's changed? Well, the first is obviously resolution. The PlayStation 2 original runs at 512 by 448. In this case, we're playing the game using the anamorphic widescreen mode, which then has to be stretched out and scaled to fit a 16 by 9 1080p screen, and the results really aren't very good. Fine detail is completely crushed, there's plenty of jaggies, and the presentation is very soft. Obviously, this is not how you'd play the game back in the day on a native resolution CRT screen. But ultimately, on a modern TV outside of emulation, if you're using real hardware or playing the PS2 game on PS3, this is the kind of results you'll be getting. And the remaster is a massive improvement in this regard. Rendering at native 1080p on PlayStation 4, the game appears a lot sharper and cleaner. Jaggies are virtually nowhere to be found, and we get a very smooth presentation with great image quality all round here. This means that fine details are now clearly resolved in the distance, and it allows us to really appreciate the attention to detail Square Enix put when developing the game on PlayStation 2. There's a lot of cool complex scenery here, at least for the time. Image quality is also improved via the use of mip-mapping, which means that textures generally get anti-aliasing across the entire scene, whereas on PlayStation 2 there's no mip-mapping at all, so there's a lot of shimmering across texture details, particularly as they move further away from the camera. But they're completely eradicated on the remaster, and this gives the presentation a massive boost. That's on base PlayStation 4, but what about PS4 Pro? Well, switching the machine to 4K, and the results are, well, I guess kind of mixed. The images we get appear quite soft, and it's clear we're not looking at a native 4K presentation. Don't get me wrong, I think image quality itself is actually pretty good in a sense that the presentation remains smooth and there aren't any jaggies to be found. Upscaling artifacts are also very well smoothed over too, so it's not that we're looking at a rough presentation by any means, it's just that it looks softer than what it should do running at 4K. And that's because we're only looking at a 1440p resolution on PlayStation 4 Pro. Yeah, that's kind of disappointing to see in the latest AAA titles, but in a remaster, I kind of think it's unacceptable that the PS4 Pro isn't delivering a native 4K performance here. And really that's what we should be expecting with this remaster. After all, Square Enix's own remasters for Kingdom Hearts, particularly Dream Drop Distance, which I covered myself, runs at 4K and also at 60 frames per second. It's a great remaster. And while we can't expect 60 FPS on all of these remasters, 4K resolution for PlayStation 4 Pro for a PS2 remaster really should be the baseline here. Hopefully Virtuous will deliver a patch to give us a boost in resolution that takes better advantage of PS4 Pro. But overall, whether you're playing on PS4 or the Pro, both versions deliver a better experience than playing the PS2 game on the PS2 or PS3 on a modern day TV. Resolution is of course one of the most important upgrades in the remaster, but it's certainly not the only one, and the PS4 game has been reworked in a number of areas, in order to allow the presentation to hold up better when run at HD resolutions. In order to show these differences more clearly, I decided to play the PS2 game via emulation, using PCSX2 running in 1080p. The idea is to take the resolution out of the equation so you can see what's changed in terms of asset and effects quality, and I think you'll find the results pretty revealing. The most obvious thing that stands out is with regards to texture quality. Now, the remaster still appears to be using the same source textures in the original game, but the developers here have upscaled them using a filter that tends to smooth over and soften hard edges. This means that the textures tend to hold up better when stretched across HD resolutions such as 1080p or 1440p. However, it does mean that some of the more angular details look a little bit off, a little bit rounded and smoother than expected. And likewise, the black outlines or black portions of the textures are more highlighted in the remaster. Personally, I'm not that keen on the way some of the texture details look, but it is personal preference. Some fans will love the effect, others may not be too happy with it. What I will say though is that the way textures are displayed in the remaster avoids the kind of blocky, almost pixelated look of the assets in the original game run at HD resolutions. And this is one of the reasons why the developers may have chosen to do this. The other reason may be because the remaster features the use of bump mapping across the textures. Surfaces are embossed with various indentations, which give flat surfaces more of a three-dimensional look. The effect is pretty subtle, but I think it works quite well overall, and I think that it would definitely fare better with these upscaled textures rather than using the original assets displayed at a higher resolution, as details tend to be resolved to a slightly higher standard. The core artwork is embellished in other areas too, so metallic, shiny surfaces feature additional specular and diffuse reflections, which gives these elements an extra level of sheen and refinement not found in the PS2 originals. The other big difference of course comes with regards to the lighting. When first playing the remaster, my thoughts was that some of the scenes appeared slightly more moody or atmospheric compared to the original PS2 release, and this is because the lighting model has been reworked. So dark scenes feature more areas covered in shade, and this creates more of a moody look to the scenery. Additionally, things like bloom across certain lighting effects also flesh out these scenes, and really it kind of adds to a presentation that has more three-dimensionality and depth to it, something that works better in HD resolutions. Shadow quality is also enhanced in these scenes too. For example, characters now project an accurate shadow across the ground rather than the basic circular shadows we see on PS2. The remaster also employs ambient occlusion, so that there's more depth around certain surfaces in the environment, and this basically means that various objects from characters, buildings, all sit more naturally in the environment. Whereas in the PlayStation 2 original, sometimes the game can appear a little flat, despite some nice lighting on show from time to time. There are also some more subtle tweaks in play as well. The post-processing pipeline is enhanced with greater use of depth of field during both cutscenes and gameplay. Indeed, depth of field is used in the PS2 original, but the effect feels more consistently deployed in the PS4 remaster without impacting on the original artistic direction of the game. And I think that's true for a lot of these enhancements. There's a sense that the developer has made logical choices in where to upgrade the art and effects work. The idea is to try and preserve the original artistic intent, but also make sure that it looks good on a HD screen, and I think for the most part it works rather well. One area where I was a little disappointed with the conversion is in terms of performance. Usually with a high definition remaster we expect 60 frames per second. Basically a doubling in frame rate from the usual 30 frames per second we see on some of the more elaborate PlayStation 2 era titles, but that's not the case here, and indeed Final Fantasy XII runs at 30 frames per second on both PS4 and PS4 Pro. Now, to be honest, there is a good reason for this. if you remember the Final Fantasy X remasters, you'll note that Square Enix designed those titles explicitly around a 30 FPS update. It's not just graphics running at that frame rate, but also the core gameplay mechanics as well. So if you uncap the frame rate, there's the potential for the game to break and unusual stuff to happen, such as things running at twice the speed and some things just not working correctly at all. That means it's not a trivial task in getting these types of games running at 60 frames per second. It requires some of the core fundamentals to be completely rewritten around a higher frame rate, and that's extremely time consuming for a remaster. So like with Final Fantasy X, that's why we're looking at 30 frames per second, and to be honest, I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. Personally, I would have loved to see 60 FPS, and it disappoints me that we're not looking at that level of fluidity here. After all, there are times when, even if you're looking at a solid 30 frames per second, there can still be some judder on screen, usually when there's lateral camera movement during the cutscenes. Something that you can't really avoid with this lower frame rate unless you start pushing tons of motion blur into the equation. On the plus side, I can argue that Final Fantasy XII as an RPG doesn't really require high precision, low latency controls, and personally I found the action plays out just fine at 30 frames per second. What's more important here is maintaining a consistent frame rate, and for the most part both PS4 and PS4 Pro do the job quite nicely. Now, I was disappointed to see the occasional 1 FPS drop from time to time. Thankfully, I didn't really notice this during gameplay, and clearly it doesn't really impact on the action, but given the power of the hardware, we'd expect a lock solid 30 FPS throughout. That said, I do find the experience to be very playable, and it felt and looked consistent for the most part, at least for the opening few hours of the game. So in that respect, performance holds up quite well, and there are less in the way of 1 FPS drops compared to say the original PS2 game. And the experience is still great running at 30 frames per second, there aren't really any problems here. It's not just the improved visuals that makes this a worthwhile upgrade, but also changes to the gameplay as well. The Zodiac Age remaster is based on the international Japanese release, which featured a ton of tweaks over the original Western version. For example, there's a brand new license board which is more easy to navigate, and the option to also toggle a transparent map over the screen, along with other changes, such as the way spells are handled. In the PlayStation 2 original, these were buffered in order to manage the rendering load, but on PlayStation 4 buffering is thrown out so you can chain tons of spells together. These are just some of the few tweaks available that you won't find with the original Western release. And as a result, I think that the remaster is perhaps the definitive way to play the game. Overall then, I think generally Virtuous has done a great job with this Final Fantasy XII remaster. Some of the changes may not appeal to all fans, particularly with regards to the way the textures are handled, but to be honest, when dealing with HD presentation, I can at least see where the developer was coming from and why some of the choices might have been made. Overall though, I think the presentation really does hold up, especially if you compare it to say the PS2 version running in HD versus the remaster. PS2 game still holds up pretty well, but the remaster delivers an extra layer of polish you won't get just by playing older games in higher resolutions. And I think things such as the lighting and effects work, improved image quality, and various tweaks in other areas all add to a very refined experience. Really, the only disappointment here comes with PlayStation 4 Pro support and that 1440p resolution, which really should be running at native 4K. This is something I definitely like to see addressed in the future. But for now, if you're looking for the best way of playing Final Fantasy XII on a modern TV, then this is definitely the way to do it. Anyway, I think I'll leave it there. I hope you enjoyed my look at Final Fantasy XII, and if you did, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.